Greetings and welcome to Brother T TV. We have to address some of these most ridiculous takes by Mr. Gilbert Arenas. Not only by Mr. Gilbert Arenas, but many of those who do podcasts that did not see some of the NBA players of the past. Those who did not see Wilt, but they have extensive comments on Wilt Chamberlain. Who did not see Kareem in his prime, or Magic, or Bird, or even Michael Jordan in his prime. If you saw Michael Jordan, bald Michael Jordan, that wasn't the prime Michael Jordan. So let us listen to what Mr. Gilbert Arenas has to say, and let us come back and comment.
I don't understand what we're talking about here, because whenever they make an argument or try to make a point, they use the same six players. The same six players to make arguments. Okay, we're going to take those six. We're going to move them. How about the other fucking 450 players that played in the 80s? You know the Knicks teams where they were throwing games for that drug? The Phillies teams where they were throwing games for the drug? That's the type of league that it was. They were literally throwing games for drug habits. Wow. And you're telling me that's the era that's supposed to be this golden shit? It's only golden because it was the merge. Then you had Magic and Bird being the face of the league at that point in time. And race wars going on. You know, you had every black person, Spanish person on the West Coast rooting for Magic Johnson and the Lakers, because there was only fucking two TV channels. Either you're going to watch the Lakers or you're going to watch Boston. And then you had everybody over in Boston rooting for the legends.
So what do you say, because we're going to get into it a little bit. Normally we don't like to feed the trolls, but you know, we were touched by it. We talked about it yesterday during our pre-production meeting. So MJ and Hakeem are a part of the 80s generation.
Cap
Rooney? Cap? What kind of cap?
Okay, see, this is, so I can break it down. So this is how it works. All right, so we'll use the 80s. So 1980 to 1984, those are your decade players, right? You don't want to be drafted in 85 or 84, 85 or 85, 86, right? Those were called tweeners. That's your tweener years. Anybody after that, you might as well look to the new decade, because the fact that 77, 78, 79 players, they go through your first 3 years. So basically in the NBA, it's going to take you about 3 years before you can actually get into your groove, right? So those 70, late 70 players, they're going to be priming soon as the decade starts in the 80s. So they have 10 years of work they're going to do. You know, anybody 85, which is going to be Jordan, Hakeem, and Barkley, you have to come out the gates running, man. So even the great Jordan, he still don't make the first team decade averaging 36 and all that, because he still only played 5 years. Yeah. So he has 5 years worth of stats versus someone who played that decade for 10 years. So when you do the decade count, Jordan ranked 8th, Hakeem ranked 10th, Barkley didn't even rank in the top 10 because of that, because he started off the first 2 years. So those players after 84 going on, they're not going to be all decade players. So they will be priming in the following year. That's why Jordan is considered a 90s player.
Well, Jordan did win 4 of his 5 MVPs in the 90s. He did win one in the 80s.
He was a 90s player.
6 finals MVPs came in the 90s.
90s player.
His only defensive player of the year, though, came in
the 80s. The only two people I've ever heard called him an 80s player was Chris and what was his name?
Rob Parker.
Now let's deal with this point about the 80s players. This is probably the most ridiculous take that he had during the entire conversation. He stated that Michael Jordan was not an 80s player. Now, this can be easily dispelled or proven as false, because Michael Jordan was on the first team, all-decade team of the 80s. Michael Jordan came in the NBA in 1984. He played 6 years of the 80s. He played 7 years of the 90s. So just because you played in the 90s, that don't exclude you from being a player or a top player in the 80s. You can be a top star in the league for more than one decade. Michael Jordan and Hakeem Olajuwon was most certainly 80s basketball players. They came in the league in 1984, and they played their first game in October of 1984. So 6 years of the 80s, they played in the league, and 4 years they did not. So this makes that statement of Gilbert Arenas totally untrue. Now let's deal with this golden era that he spoke of. The only reason that the 80s were the golden era or classified as the golden era is because of Bird and Magic. This is revisionist history at best. The king of the NBA at that time in the early 80s, the one that wore the crown, was not Bird and Magic in the early 80s. They only had been in the league 3 or 4 years before the coming of Michael Jordan. The king of the NBA at that time was Julius Erving. Julius Erving is the NBA player that was the most marketed player at that time. He was the one that they made the movies about. He is the one that came out with the first Space Jam movie that was called The Fish That Saved Pittsburgh, which the Space Jam movie was patterned after. He is the one that had the most popular NBA shoes called the J's, or the Converse Leather All-Stars. It was his shoe that Magic Johnson and Larry Bird duplicated, but they were called J's. And Magic Johnson got the J's in the Los Angeles Lakers colors. And Larry Bird got the J's in the Boston Celtic color. And they came out in the color black. But the young NBA players that were coming up, the young college players that were coming up, could not wear Larry Bird shoes, and they could not wear Magic Johnson shoes, because at that time you could only wear black shoes if you played away, or you could wear white. But most college and high school teams always wore white gym shoes during those early days. Those were the only legal colors that you could wear at that time. So Dr. J had the most popular shoes. He was the most popular player. Then he won the NBA Finals in around 1982 or so, 1982 or 1983. So he was still popular at that time. And 2 years later, here comes Michael Jordan, who took the league by storm. So Bird and Magic only had a hold of the league basically only about 2 years before the coming of Michael Jordan. So the golden era was not due to Magic and Bird. The golden era was due to all the top players that had come at that time in the early 80s. You had Dr. J, you had Bird, you had Magic, you had Iceman George Gervin, you had Moses Malone, you had Daryl Dawkins, who were breaking the backboards at that time. You had World Be Free. You had Tiny Archibald for the Boston Celtics, the only player in NBA history to lead the league in scoring and assists in the same year. You had Sugar Ray Richardson, or Michael Ray Richardson, who got caught up in the cocaine scandal. You had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Later you had Dominique Wilkins, Reggie Theus for the Bulls before Jordan got there. You had Jamal Silk Wilkes, who played in the movie Cornbread Earl and Me, or early basketball movie. Later you had James Worthy. Early on you had David Thompson, one of the first dunk masters. You have Dr. Duncanstein, Darrell Griffin. Then you had Bernard King, or the King brothers, and Alex English, Isaiah Thomas. Then you had the Stockton and Malone, Gus Williams of the Sonics, and Dennis Johnson, who played with him with the Sonics and won a championship, and eventually went over to the Boston Celtics and won a championship with Larry Bird. These were very popular players back in those days. This is what made it the golden age. You had Mark Aguirre, Patrick Ewing, Larry Nance, and Sidney Moncrief, one of the greatest defensive players of all time. There's many more that I didn't mention, like Ralph Sampson, the first Wembanyama. These are all players that played in the golden age, and very few of them had any type of cocaine issues. There may have been one or two that I mentioned in that roster. There's one other issue I want to address that Gilbert Arenas made. He said there was only 2 TV channels, so you can only watch either the Lakers or Boston. Gilbert Arenas was born in 1982. When Michael Jordan came to the league, he was only 2 years old. So it's very silly for anyone to try to tell you something that took place in history when they were barely even born, unless they do a thorough historical research or talk to people that were actually there during that time. Yes, there were 2 channels. The NBA on CBS, we had ESPN, and the NBA on NBC. Later we had the ESPN. Okay. But in every city you had a local channel that showed every game of that particular location. So if you lived in Chicago, you saw all the Bulls games, and you saw all of the teams that they played against for that entire year. In Chicago, the Chicago Bulls, you would see they had a Channel 9, WGN, where they played every game, both home and away. If you lived in Detroit, they played the Detroit games. So you weren't regulated to just only being able to see the Boston Celtics if you lived on the East Coast, or the Los Angeles Lakers if you lived on the West Coast. I, growing up personally, was not a Laker fan nor a Boston Celtic fan. Most of us and most of my peers, we followed the Philadelphia 76ers because our favorite player, or the most popular player at that time, similar to LeBron James, was Dr. J. or Julius Erving. Magic Johnson had an impact on the West Coast, and Bird had an impact on the East Coast. It wasn't that way across the entire nation. So this is another misconception that Mr. Gilbert Arenas has. We should stop listening to those who weren't born during the time of these particular players like Wilt, and did not see Wilt, and did not see Kareem in his early years, or did not see Bird or Magic or Julius Erving, or even Michael Jordan, or LeBron James for that matter. We should stop listening to those who give some type of narrative that did not actually live during that time, or were barely even born during that time, unless they do a thorough research of history and interview people that were actually there, and just don't go off of something they've seen off a YouTube video. If I'm a witness to a bear attack and see him maul a human being, and you see it later on the news, who do you think will have a better description of what actually took place? You can say, well, I saw it just like you. I saw it on the news. And who would have a better understanding if you see it 15, 20, or even 30 years later? You can say, well, I seen a man attack. It was no big deal. And I say, yes, it was a big deal, because actually 15 people got attacked that day, because the bear cage at the zoo was open. Someone left it open, and all the bears escaped, and 15 people were attacked. But the only one that you saw was the one that they caught on the news. So you can't give a full description or the full impact of what took place with that event unless you go and interview those who were there during the time of that type of event. So the next video, we're going to come out with a distinct historical account of the career of Michael Jordan and what was taking place during his evolution into the NBA. Thanks for listening, and leave your comments below.